For more than 2 decades, Sir Alex Ferguson managed some of the greatest footballers Manchester United had ever seen: champions, captains, match winners, players who defined entire generations. So when Ferguson was asked to choose his greatest United team, he immediately faced a problem. There were simply too many. Peter Schmeichel or Edwin van der Sar in goal, Stam, Ferdinand, Bruce and Pallister at the back. Then came a midfield packed with legends, and an attack filled with some of the most feared players in Europe. Even David Beckham couldn't be guaranteed a place. Ferguson said he was knocking on the door. Wayne Rooney made the decision even harder. Ferguson joked that if he left Rooney out, he'd have to tell him by email, or he'd never hear the end of it. But then Ferguson changed the question. Instead of trying to squeeze every legend into one team, he asked himself something much simpler. Who were the players he simply could not leave out? That changed everything. Among all those great names, a tiny group began to separate itself. Not because they were identical, quite the opposite. One represented leadership, another represented relentless standards. One possessed an extraordinary football brain, another survived almost every version of Ferguson's United. One transformed the mentality of the club, and another developed into perhaps the greatest individual talent Ferguson ever coached. But when he considered the players he simply couldn't leave out of his greatest United side, 6 remarkable names stood above the rest. And the first takes us back to the difficult years before Ferguson's Manchester United became unstoppable. Subscribe and stay with us, as Ferguson's 6 extraordinary choices are revealed. The first name takes us back to the hardest years of Ferguson's Manchester United reign. Brian Robson. When Ferguson considered the midfielders he simply couldn't leave out, his answer came immediately: Brian Robson for sure.
He has the animal running style of a long, striding player, and it's quite exciting actually to see him in full flow when the legs open up. And for a smallish lad, he has a tremendously long stride.
And that choice says plenty about what Ferguson valued. He didn't sign Robson. He inherited him when he arrived at Old Trafford in 1986. United were still years away from becoming the dominant force English football would come to fear, and Ferguson was still trying to build something capable of lasting. Through those difficult years, Robson was his captain. He could tackle, drive forward and score important goals. But Ferguson valued something even greater than his ability: his courage, his influence, and his refusal to hide when United were struggling. Robson didn't simply wear the armband. He carried the responsibility that came with it. Years later, after more than 2 decades of building championship-winning teams, Ferguson still described Robson as easily the best captain I had. That is an extraordinary verdict. Entire generations had passed through Ferguson's dressing room. New leaders had emerged. New champions had been created. Yet Robson remained his benchmark for captaincy. And his importance becomes clearer when you remember Ferguson's early years. The trophies didn't arrive immediately. There was pressure. There were doubts. And Ferguson's entire United project was still being built. Then came the 1990 FA Cup, Ferguson's first major trophy at the club. Robson lifted it as captain. A year later came the European Cup Winners' Cup. Then, in 1993, United finally ended their 26-year wait for the league title. Robson was still there. By then, he was approaching the end of his United career, but his place in Ferguson's story was already secure. He finished with 461 appearances and 99 goals. Yet numbers don't explain why Ferguson couldn't leave him out. Robson mattered because he was there before the dynasty, before the endless championships, before Ferguson's United became feared across England and Europe. When Ferguson was still laying the foundations, Robson was the captain he could trust. And decades later, Captain Marvel still stood apart. Ferguson managed extraordinary footballers, but when he described Roy Keane, he used words that eclipsed almost all of them. He is the best player I have had in all of my time here. That was Ferguson's verdict. And it wasn't simply about talent. Keane represented the standards Ferguson demanded from Manchester United: intensity, responsibility, leadership, and an obsession with winning. Ferguson said Keane's demands on those around him made him the most influential player in the dressing room. Keane joined United in 1993 for a then British record £3.75 million. Before long, he became the heartbeat of Ferguson's midfield. When standards dropped, Keane reacted. When pressure arrived, he wanted responsibility. And no performance captured that better than Turin in 1999. United faced Juventus in the Champions League semi-final. Within 11 minutes, they were 2-0 down. Then Keane headed United back into the contest. Later, he received a yellow card. He knew immediately what it meant. If United reached the final, their captain wouldn't be playing. But Keane didn't disappear. He kept running, kept tackling, kept driving United forward. Ferguson later remembered how Keane covered every blade of grass. United completed an extraordinary comeback and won 3-2. They were going to the Champions League final. Keane wasn't. That night showed exactly why Ferguson valued him so highly. Keane eventually made 480 appearances for United and captained one of the greatest periods in the club's history. But numbers were never the real measure of him. His greatest value was the standard he imposed on everyone around him. Ferguson controlled Manchester United from the touchline. On the pitch, Roy Keane carried those same demands into battle. And that made him almost impossible for Ferguson to leave out. For one player, Ferguson didn't simply say he belonged in the team. He made the point almost impossible to misunderstand. Ryan Giggs. Ferguson's words were emphatic. Never, ever leave him out. That tells you what Giggs became to Ferguson. Not simply a brilliant winger, not simply another trophy winner. He became permanent. Giggs broke into United's first team as a teenager and remained there through almost every version of Ferguson's great sides. Teams changed. Tactics changed. Entire generations came and went. Giggs remained. At his peak, he could destroy defenders with pace and close control. Later, when that explosive speed began to fade, he adapted. He became calmer, smarter, more versatile, and Ferguson kept finding ways to use him. One moment captured the brilliance of the younger Giggs better than almost any other. The 1999 FA Cup semi-final replay against Arsenal. Extra time. United down to 10 men. Then Giggs collected a loose pass and exploded forward. He went past one defender, then another, before smashing the ball beyond David Seaman. When Ferguson was later asked for the greatest goal scored under his management, he chose that one. His description was simple, out of this world. But Giggs's real greatness to Ferguson wasn't one unforgettable goal. It was everything that followed. He eventually made 963 appearances for Manchester United, more than anyone in the club's history. And even after Ferguson retired, Giggs continued playing. That longevity explains why Ferguson's original words carry so much weight. Never, ever leave him out. Because Ferguson rebuilt Manchester United again and again. But Ryan Giggs was one piece he never truly needed to replace. Some players impressed Ferguson with power or personality. Paul Scholes impressed him with his mind. When Ferguson considered the midfielders he simply couldn't leave out, Scholes was firmly among them. And his assessment of Scholes explained why. He's got the best skills, the best brain. That was the difference. Scholes rarely needed the spotlight. He controlled matches without demanding it. His first touch created space. His passing changed the direction of attacks. And he often seemed to know what was happening before everyone else. Ferguson trusted that intelligence for years. Scholes could score from midfield, play behind the striker, control the centre, and later dictate games from deeper positions. But one part of his European story remained painful. In 1999, Scholes helped United reach the Champions League final. Then suspension ruled him out. He watched from the stands as United completed their historic treble in Barcelona. 9 years later, another opportunity arrived. United faced Barcelona in the 2008 Champions League semi-final. The tie was on a knife edge. Then Scholes produced the decisive moment. One strike from distance sent United to Moscow. This time, Ferguson made sure Scholes started the final. United became European champions again. And years later, when Ferguson used the rare label of world class, Scholes was one of only 4 United players he placed in that category. He finished his career with 718 appearances, and 155 goals for the club. But Ferguson's admiration was never really about the numbers. It was about how Scholes understood football. Others could play the game. Scholes seemed to see it before it happened. Some players entered Ferguson's team and made it stronger. Eric Cantona changed what the team believed it could become. When Ferguson considered the players he simply couldn't leave out, Cantona was one of them. And his explanation went far beyond goals. Ferguson once said, "If ever there was a player made for United, it was Cantona." That was exactly what Cantona became. He arrived from Leeds in November 1992. United had gone 26 years without winning the league title. They had talent, they had ambition, but something was still missing. Cantona brought belief, swagger, imagination, and an authority that immediately fitted Old Trafford. In his first season, United finally became champions again, but his influence wasn't limited to match days. Ferguson admired the way Cantona trained. Young players watched him stay behind and practice. They saw the seriousness behind the famous turned-up collar, and that influence became part of the culture Ferguson was building. Cantona's United career lasted less than 5 full seasons, yet he won 4 league titles, and in 1996 he delivered one of his defining moments: the FA Cup final against Liverpool. The match remained goalless until the closing minutes. Then Cantona struck. United won 1-0, and as captain, he lifted the trophy. That was Cantona. Not the longest career, not the biggest numbers, but enormous moments, enormous personality, and enormous influence. Even years later, when Ferguson reserved the label world class for only a tiny handful of his United players, Cantona remained among them. That explains why Ferguson couldn't leave him out. Cantona didn't need 20 years to become indispensable. A few extraordinary seasons were enough to help change Manchester United forever. By this point, Ferguson had already spent years working with elite footballers. But Cristiano Ronaldo eventually earned a different kind of verdict. Ferguson said, "Cristiano Ronaldo was the most gifted player I managed." Those words explain why Ronaldo belongs among the players Ferguson simply couldn't leave out. When he arrived at Old Trafford in 2003, Ronaldo was only 18. The talent was obvious. The finished player was not. He had speed, skill, fearless dribbling, and the confidence to attack defenders repeatedly. But Ferguson wanted more than entertainment. He wanted Ronaldo to become decisive. Over the following seasons, the tricks became goals. The potential became consistency. And the teenager became one of the most dangerous footballers in Europe. The transformation peaked in 2007-08. Ronaldo scored 42 goals in all competitions. United won the Premier League. Then came the Champions League final against Chelsea. Ronaldo scored United's goal in Moscow, and although his penalty was saved in the shootout, United survived and became champions of Europe. Later that year, Ronaldo won the Ballon d'Or. Ferguson had watched the raw teenager become the best player in the world, and his admiration went beyond that single season. When looking back on the great players he had managed, Ferguson said Ronaldo had surpassed them as an individual talent. Ronaldo later described Ferguson as his father in football. That relationship mattered. Ferguson gave him freedom to develop, but he also demanded end product: more goals, better decisions, greater responsibility. By the time Ronaldo left for Real Madrid in 2009, he had scored 118 goals in 292 United appearances. But the numbers only tell part of the story. Ferguson had signed potential. 6 years later, he watched that potential leave Old Trafford as a Ballon d'Or winner. And among all the extraordinary footballers Ferguson coached, his verdict remained unmistakable. Cristiano Ronaldo was the most gifted of them all. In the end, these choices tell us something important about Sir Alex Ferguson himself. He never judged greatness on reputation alone. Talent mattered, but so did character, pressure, consistency, and what a player gave when the team needed him most. Ferguson saw these men differently from supporters. He watched them train. He saw them after defeats. He knew who demanded more from teammates, and who could be trusted when everything was on the line. That was Ferguson's great strength. He understood that greatness came in different forms. Some players needed guidance, Others needed challenging, and a rare few became men he simply couldn't imagine leaving out. So when Ferguson spoke about his greatest players, his judgment carried something statistics never could. He had lived those careers beside them. He had tested them, trusted them, and watched them under the greatest pressure. That is what made these 6 stand apart in Ferguson's memory. Subscribe as we keep the words and memories of football's greatest figures alive.